3 days ago, Parker Schnabel uncovered something in the Klondike that brought his entire mining operation to a standstill. It wasn't gold. It wasn't a mechanical breakdown. It was a discovery so deeply personal and so completely unexpected that for the first time in 15 seasons, the toughest young miner in the Yukon broke down on camera. A frozen time capsule. On November 23rd, 2024, temperatures at Dominion Creek had plunged to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold was so severe that machinery had to be kept running around the clock to prevent diesel fuel from turning to gel and hydraulic lines from freezing solid. Parker stood at the edge of the cut, watching his excavator claw through permafrost that hadn't seen daylight for thousands of years. They were mining deeper than Parker had ever gone on this claim, chasing a pay layer that ground-penetrating radar suggested could be the richest stretch of Dominion Creek he'd found in 5 years. The crew was exhausted. They'd been grinding through 16-hour days, racing to hit bedrock before winter shut them down for good. Parker's foreman, Brennan Ruolt, had been pushing hard to stop. He warned that the risk of catastrophic equipment failure in those temperatures wasn't worth squeezing out a few more days of mining. But Parker had that feeling. The instinct his grandfather John had tried to teach him. The sense that something important was waiting just beneath the surface, if he had the courage to keep digging. Then it happened. The excavator bucket punched through a layer of ice-cemented gravel and lifted out what looked like an ordinary load: frozen muck, rocks, and ancient organic material packed into dark sediment. But as the operator swung the bucket towards the sluice box, something caught the light. Something metallic, angular, unmistakably unnatural among the rounded stones. Parker saw it instantly and yelled for the operator to stop. His breath billowed in the frozen air as he ran towards the machine. Embedded in the gravel was a metal box, roughly 12 inches square and 8 inches deep, coated in rust and sediment, yet astonishingly intact. The permafrost had preserved it like a natural freezer, protecting it from the decay that would have destroyed anything left on the surface. Parker reached in carefully. Even through thick gloves, he could feel its weight. Solid, heavy, unmistakably full. He carried it to the heated workshop as the crew gathered around, drawn by the rare moment when routine mining suddenly turns into something far more mysterious. Finding artifacts in the Klondike wasn't unusual. Miners regularly uncovered mammoth tusks, ancient tools, and relics from the gold rush of the 1890s. But this felt different. Personal, in a way Parker couldn't yet explain. Inside the warmth of the workshop, Parker gently cleaned the box, brushing away layers of frozen sediment and ice crystals. As the surface emerged, his heart began to race. The box was steel, hand-welded at the corners with careful craftsmanship, the kind made by someone who expected it to endure harsh conditions. And scratched into the lid with a sharp tool were 2 initials and a date: JS-1946. Parker's hand started to shake. J.S. John Schnabel, his grandfather. But that made no sense. Parker knew his grandfather's story. John hadn't come to Alaska until the 1970s. Before that, he'd been a successful businessman in Oregon. Later in life, he'd discovered mining, brought his family north, and built Big Nugget Mine into a legendary operation. There was no chapter from 1946, no tale of a young John Schnabel hiding out in the Yukon. Yet the initials were unmistakable, etched in the same distinctive style Parker had seen in his grandfather's handwriting countless times. And the box itself was exactly the sort of thing John would have made. Practical, sturdy, designed to protect something valuable from brutal conditions. Parker carefully worked the latch. Though corroded, it still functioned. The lid lifted open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept moisture out for nearly 80 years, were papers, dozens of letters written in his grandfather's hand. There were photographs, still remarkably vivid. A small leather journal with entries dated from April through November of 1946, and beneath it all, a pocket watch, engraved with initials that were not John's. E.M.R. Parker lifted one of the letters. The paper was brittle despite its protection. He began to read. The first line stopped him cold. Dear Eleanor, I know you'll never read this, but I'm writing anyway because I don't know how else to survive what happened. The letter went on. I came to the Yukon to forget you, to disappear into a land so hard and unforgiving that it wouldn't leave room for grief. But the silence up here only makes your absence louder. Parker looked up at his crew, who were watching him with growing concern. The toughest young miner in the Yukon, the man who had taken his grandfather's legacy and expanded it beyond anything John had imagined, sat there holding letters from a version of his grandfather he never knew existed. A young man, heartbroken, hiding in the Klondike in 1946. In that moment, Parker realized that everything he thought he understood about his family, about the man who raised him and taught him mining, was incomplete. John Schnabel had a secret journey. Parker sent the crew back to work and spent the rest of the day alone in the workshop, reading every letter and journal entry, piecing together a story that explained so much, and yet made his grandfather feel like a stranger. The story that emerged was painfully simple. In 1945, John Schnabel had been engaged to be married to a woman named Eleanor Marie Richardson, the EMR engraved on the pocket watch. The early letters were filled with the kind of hope and idealism only young men have. John wrote about building a business, buying a house for Eleanor, raising a family, and creating a future together in post-war America. He had served in the Pacific during World War II. He'd survived battles that killed thousands, and when he came home, he believed that surviving the war meant he had earned a peaceful, prosperous life. What happened next would change everything, and eventually lead him to the frozen ground of the Yukon. But in the spring of 1946, everything John had planned fell apart. The journal entries from April were broken and scattered, returning again and again to one devastating truth. Eleanor was gone. The details were few. John's grief was too raw to put into full sentences. But from what Parker could piece together, Eleanor had fallen ill. It had happened quickly, and John had been completely powerless to save her. One entry, dated April 19th, said it all. Buried her today. I don't know how to exist in a world where she doesn't. After that, the journal traced John's decision to leave Oregon, to run as far as possible from the life he had planned, and from the memories that haunted every familiar street. He had heard stories from other veterans about the Yukon, a place so remote and unforgiving that it left no room for grief, where a man could work himself to exhaustion and maybe find a reason to keep going. In May of 1946, John loaded what little he owned into a truck and drove north, crossing into Canada and eventually reaching Dawson City. As Parker read, tears fell. Tears he hadn't shed since his grandfather's death in 2016. For the first time, he understood the depth of loss that had shaped the man he'd known. The grandfather Parker remembered had been tough, demanding, and nearly impossible to impress, always pushing him to work harder, dig deeper, and never settle for good enough. Parker had sometimes resented that hardness. He'd wondered why John struggled to show approval or affection. But reading the words of a shattered 24-year-old, Parker finally understood. His grandfather had rebuilt himself from complete devastation, and in doing so, had learned to protect his heart by never fully opening it again. The 1946 journal chronicled John's first months in the Yukon, working placer claims for other miners and learning the brutal reality of the job, moving frozen gravel, running sluice boxes, and enduring ground that could turn to concrete overnight. He wrote about grizzly bears, endless mosquitoes, and a level of isolation so deep that days passed without speaking to another person. Yet slowly, entry by entry, the journal revealed something else. Healing. John never stopped writing about Eleanor. He didn't forget her. But over time, he learned how to carry his grief instead of letting it crush him. He wrote about finding meaning in hard work, about the honest simplicity of mining, where effort turned directly into gold, and a man's worth was measured by what he pulled from the ground, not by status or connections. By August, John wrote about feeling alive again. By September, he described forming friendships with other miners, bonds forged through shared hardship. For the first time, He began to imagine a future that went beyond mere survival. Then came an entry from late October. One Parker read 3 times, trying to fully grasp its meaning. "I've decided to leave the Yukon. Not because I couldn't make it here, but because I think I finally can. This place saved me. It gave me the space to grieve and rebuild. But I don't belong to the wilderness. I belong to the world, and I think I'm finally strong enough to return to it. I'm taking Eleanor's watch and these letters and burying them at the claim I've been working. Someday, maybe decades from now, another miner will find them, and they'll know someone came here broken and left whole." Parker sat with those words for a long time. The box he had found wasn't lost. It wasn't forgotten. John had buried it on purpose, a time capsule marking his transformation, physical proof of the journey from devastation to healing. And now, 78 years later, John's grandson had uncovered it while mining the very same ground. The connection across nearly 8 decades felt almost unreal. But one question still lingered. If John left the Yukon in 1946, what happened during the decades before he returned in the 1970s? Who did he become in those years? And most importantly, where did Parker's grandmother fit into a story that was supposed to end with Eleanor, the woman in the photographs? Among the letters and journals, Parker found a small collection of photographs documenting John's 1946 journey. They showed a much younger version of his grandfather than Parker had ever seen, a 24-year-old who looked both old and young at once, aged by war and grief, but still carrying the vulnerability of youth. There were photos of John standing beside sluice boxes, mountains rising behind him. Photos of him with other miners, filthy, exhausted, and grinning with the unmistakable camaraderie of shared struggle. But the images that held Parker's attention were the ones of Eleanor. There were 5 photographs carefully preserved in the oilcloth. They showed a beautiful young woman with dark hair and an open smile that radiated warmth even after 78 years. In one picture, Eleanor and John stood together, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. Both looked straight into the camera with the quiet confidence of people who believed their future was certain. On the back, in John's handwriting, were the words, "Oregon, December 1944. 2 months before I shipped out. Promised her I'd come back and marry her. Below that, kept the first promise. Never got to keep the second." Parker stared at the photograph for a long time. This woman, erased from family history, should have been his grandmother. Their children should have been his parents. The entire Schnabel family line Parker belonged to shouldn't exist at all. His life was only possible because Eleanor had died, and John had eventually built a different future. It was a disturbing realization that his own existence depended on someone else's tragedy. It made Parker think about his actual grandmother, the woman John married years later after returning from the Yukon. Parker had known her, loved her, and watched her life with John unfold. They had seemed solid and genuinely affectionate. But had John ever told her about Eleanor? Did she know she wasn't his first love? Did she know the life they shared was built on the ashes of another one? The box couldn't answer those questions. To understand what happened between John burying those letters in 1946 and bringing his family to Alaska in the 1970s, Parker would have to dig deeper. The journal ended with John leaving the Yukon. Everything that followed existed only in records, memories, and stories Parker would now have to excavate as carefully as he excavated gold. Parker began by calling his mother. The conversation was difficult, emotional, and ultimately revealing. Yes, she confirmed that John had been married once before, very briefly, in the late 1940s, to a woman he'd known before the war. The marriage lasted less than a year and ended in an annulment. No, she didn't know the full details. John never talked about it. In the early 1950s, he met Nancy, Parker's grandmother, and together they built the life Parker had always known. But then came the detail that changed everything. Nancy had known about Eleanor. John had told her early in their relationship. He'd been honest about the woman he lost, the grief he carried, and the time he spent alone in the Yukon trying to heal. Nancy accepted that history with grace. She understood she wasn't competing with a memory, but loving a man who had been shaped by loss and had learned, slowly, how to love again. As Parker absorbed this, the story shifted once more. This wasn't a tale of secrets or betrayal. It wasn't about John abandoning Eleanor's memory to find happiness elsewhere. It was about surviving unbearable loss, healing enough to risk love again, and building a life that honored grief without being trapped by it. Still, Parker felt the need to see the places his grandfather had written about. The journal mentioned specific locations, claims John had worked, and a cabin where he'd spent the winter of 1946. Some of those places might no longer exist. But Parker wasn't just a miner. He was a student of Klondike mining history. If the cabin was still standing, he believed he could find it. Following that instinct, Parker suspended mining operations, a decision that shocked his crew, and, under normal circumstances, would have shocked his grandfather as well. But these were not normal circumstances. Parker had found something more valuable than gold: context. A deeper understanding of the man who had shaped his entire life. And he was determined to follow that trail, even if it meant sacrificing precious mining time in the narrow window before winter closed in. The journal mentioned a claim on Hunker Creek, a tributary of the Klondike River, about 15 miles southeast of Dawson City. In 1946, Hunker Creek had been bustling with mining activity, dozens of operations pulling gold from its gravels. By 2024, most of those claims had been abandoned or absorbed into larger operations. But Parker knew the area well. He'd explored Hunker Creek while researching potential claims and was familiar with its history and terrain. Parker loaded his truck with supplies and drove out alone, following rough mining roads that gradually deteriorated into narrow trails the farther he went from active operations. The journal described landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in the creek where the water ran unusually clear, and a small stand of spruce trees that had somehow survived the stripping of vegetation around them. Using those descriptions, Parker navigated the landscape, combining his grandfather's 78-year-old observations with his own knowledge of the ground. After 3 hours of searching, he found it. The rocks were still there, weathered but unmistakable. The creek still curved in the same place, even though its exact path had shifted over decades. And within the stand of spruce trees stood a small cabin, partially collapsed, but still standing. Parker approached carefully. Old structures in the Yukon can be unstable and dangerous. But the cabin's core logs were solid, and although the roof sagged, it had kept the interior mostly dry. The door hung from a single hinge, but it opened when Parker pushed gently. Inside was a space no more than 12 by 14 feet. A small wood stove, a rough wooden bunk, shelves made from uneven planks, a table and a single chair. Everything was coated in decades of dust and debris, but the essentials were unmistakable. This was where John Schnabel had lived through the winter of 1946, alone with his grief and his determination to survive it. Parker stood in the center of the cabin, imagining his grandfather at 24 years old, heating cans of food on the stove, sleeping on that bunk, sitting at that table, writing the letters Parker had found buried in the permafrost. The isolation must have been crushing. In winter, the Yukon sees only a few hours of twilight each day, with temperatures dropping 40 to 50 degrees below zero. Yet John had endured it, more than endured it. He had used it to change himself. On a shelf, Parker spotted something that caught his breath. A tin cup, rusted but intact, with 2 initials scratched into the metal. J.S., his grandfather's cup, left behind when John departed in late 1946. Parker picked it up carefully, a physical link to a hidden chapter of his grandfather's life, and felt tears well up again. He spent the rest of the day in and around the cabin, photographing everything, collecting the few remaining artifacts, and trying to absorb the emotional weight of the place. At one point, he sat where John must have sat, looking out the small window at Hunker Creek flowing past, with mountains rising beyond it. And in that quiet moment, Parker understood something profound. John Schnabel had learned lessons here, lessons forged in grief, isolation, and survival that shaped everything about how he approached life, family, and mining. He learned that survival demanded total commitment, that comfort had to be earned through relentless work, that weakness could be fatal. These weren't abstract ideas to John. They were survival tools. And when John became a grandfather, he tried to pass those tools on to Parker. Sometimes harshly, always demanding. Because John genuinely believed that toughness and discipline were acts of love. Parker had often wondered if his grandfather believed in him at all. He thought the constant pressure meant disappointment. But sitting in that cabin, holding John's tin cup, Parker finally understood the truth. The pressure came from belief. John had seen potential in Parker, and that potential terrified him because he knew how easily it could be destroyed by softness, by tragedy, by a lack of preparation. Every harsh word, every impossible standard, every demand to work harder had been John's way of trying to protect his grandson from the kind of breaking he himself had endured. As darkness fell, Parker returned to Dominion Creek. November nights come early that far north. His crew was waiting, worried about their boss, who had vanished for an entire day without explanation. And Parker knew he was carrying something back with him far heavier and far more valuable than gold. Brennan approached Parker cautiously, asking if he was okay and whether he wanted to talk about what was weighing on him. Parker shook his head. He wasn't ready to share what he'd uncovered yet. Instead, he retreated to his cabin. That night, he finished reading the journal, the final entries written in late October and early November of 1946. John wrote about his decision to leave the Yukon, about feeling ready to step back into the world he'd run from 7 months earlier. But the very last entry, dated November 2nd, revealed something Parker hadn't expected. Today, I made a choice. I could stay. I could keep mining. I could build a life in this wilderness that's given me so much. Part of me wants that. Part of me feels safer here than I ever will back in civilization. But I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding from grief. I'm carrying Elena with me. I always will. But I'm also ready to live again. And I can't do that if I stay here. So I'm leaving. I'll take only my pack and Eleanor's watch. I'm burying everything else. The letters, the photos, this journal. Because I need to let it become history instead of carrying it every day. The Yukon healed me. Now I need to trust that healing and go build whatever comes next. Parker closed the journal and sat in silence, absorbing the courage those words represented. John had been offered a refuge, a place where isolation and grief were acceptable, where a man could exist without confronting the complicated risks of emotional life. And yet, John had chosen to leave that safety. He chose vulnerability. He chose a world where love and loss were both possible. That single decision echoed through generations. If John had stayed in the Yukon in 1946, there would have been no Nancy, no children, no Parker. His willingness to risk his heart again, to believe he could love without betraying Eleanor's memory, created the family line that led Parker to this moment, 78 years later. Parker began thinking about his own life, the relationships he'd avoided, the emotional walls he'd built. He'd always believed his discomfort with intimacy was just part of his personality. Now he wondered if it was inherited, a survival strategy passed down from a grandfather who had been shattered by love and learned to protect himself by never fully opening up again, even to those he loved most. The next morning, Parker called his mother again and asked about Nancy. What had she been like? What kind of marriage had she and John shared? His mother's voice softened as she answered. Their marriage, she said, wasn't dramatic or wildly passionate. It was steady, built on respect, shared purpose, and a quiet affection that deepened over time. Your grandfather loved her, she said firmly. Not the way he loved his first fiancée, the all-or-nothing kind of love you have when you're young, but deeply, genuinely. He chose her every day, and that kind of choosing, especially after you know how badly love can hurt, that's actually stronger than the easy love of youth. Something shifted inside Parker. John hadn't settled for Nancy. He hadn't betrayed Eleanor by loving again. He had made the harder choice, to risk love despite knowing the cost, to build a family while fully understanding how fragile happiness could be. Because the alternative was the isolation he'd escaped in the Yukon. And when John eventually returned to the Yukon in the 1970s, it wasn't as a broken young man hiding from grief. It was as a grandfather, bringing his teenage grandson north, introducing him to mining, and sharing the land that had once saved him. He passed on lessons about resilience and determination, lessons learned the hardest way possible. Parker realized that every moment he'd shared with his grandfather had been shaped by that journey. Every harsh criticism, every impossible standard, every rare word of praise. John's toughness wasn't disappointment or cruelty. It was love, expressed by someone who had been broken, rebuilt, and was desperate to spare the people he loved from that same kind of pain. 3 days after Parker returned from Hunker Creek, the mining season ended. The weather turned brutal, bringing the kind of cold that shatters equipment and freezes exposed skin in minutes. Parker and his crew shut down operations, secured Dominion Creek for the winter, and prepared to leave until spring. Before they did, Parker called a crew meeting. For the first time, he told them everything. About the box, his grandfather's hidden history, the letters, the cabin, and the young man who came to the Yukon, broken and left whole. The crew listened in silence. They saw their tough, driven boss vulnerable in a way they never had before. They understood that what had been pulled from the permafrost was worth far more than gold. Finally, Brennan asked the question everyone was thinking. What are you going to do with all of it? Parker had been wrestling with that for days. Part of him wanted to keep the story private, to protect his grandfather's memory and his family's privacy. But another part knew the story mattered beyond his own experience. I'm going to share it, Parker said at last. Not everything. Not the most personal parts, but the core of it. The story about loss, healing, and the courage it takes to love again after you've been broken. I think that's a story people need, and I think my grandfather would want it told, even if he spent his life not telling it himself. Deciding whether to include the discovery on Gold Rush was harder. The show had followed Parker for 15 seasons, documenting his evolution from a kid working for his grandfather into one of the Yukon's most successful young miners. But the show was about gold, machinery, and production, not grief and family history. This discovery was deeply personal, possibly too intimate for television. After long discussions with the producers, Parker agreed to a special segment, one that would treat the story with respect, not sensationalizing the loss or exploiting his grandfather's pain, but honestly exploring how uncovering this hidden past had changed Parker's understanding of his family, his grandfather, and himself. When the segment aired in December 2024, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers who had followed Parker for years, who knew him as tough, driven, and often emotionally guarded, reached out in droves. They shared stories of inherited grief, of uncovering painful truths about family members they thought they fully understood, and of realizing that the people who shaped them were far more complex and human than they had ever imagined. Parker received hundreds of messages from people who had lost loved ones, who were struggling with how to open their hearts again after devastating loss. Many said they were moved by John Schnabel's journey, by the idea that survival didn't just mean enduring pain, but eventually finding a way to live and love again. What began as a deeply personal discovery grew into something much larger. It became a reminder that everyone carries hidden histories, that strength is often forged in unbearable suffering, and that choosing vulnerability after being broken is one of the bravest acts a person can make. For Parker, the discovery changed everything. He still approached mining with the intensity and determination his grandfather had instilled in him, but now he understood where that drive came from. He still pushed himself and his crew, but with a clearer sense of the line between meaningful challenge and unnecessary harshness. In his personal life, Parker began lowering the walls he'd built over years. He allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways that frightened him, but also felt essential. His grandfather had taught him how to be tough, But the letters from 1946 taught him something John never said out loud. Real strength includes the courage to risk your heart, even when you know exactly how much it can hurt. Parker kept the metal box, the letters, the photographs, and the tin cup from Hunker Creek. They rested on a shelf in his cabin, physical reminders of the grandfather he thought he knew and the young man he never met. Preserved by permafrost for 78 years, they formed a bridge between loss and healing, past and present. Every time Parker looked at them, he remembered that his life was shaped by both tragedy and survival. That he existed because a young man came to the Yukon broken, found a way to heal, and left strong enough to build a future that eventually led to him. The gold at Dominion Creek would one day run out. That was the nature of mining: finding what's there, extracting it, and moving on. But the legacy Parker uncovered in the permafrost, the story of resilience, redemption, and hard-earned love that explained so much about who he was inexhaustible. That was the true treasure his grandfather left behind. Not the gold Parker learned to mine, but the example of a man who survived the unthinkable and still chose to love again. What Parker Schnabel found beneath the frozen ground wasn't gold. It was his grandfather's heart, preserved for nearly 8 decades, waiting to be discovered by the grandson who needed to understand where his own toughness came from. The letters from 1946 revealed a simple truth. Strength isn't the absence of breaking. It's what you build after you've been shattered. And sometimes, the most valuable thing you can ever mine is the truth about the people who made you who you are. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Timefold channel and don't forget to like.